We are so privileged to have with us today one of New Zealand's leading thinkers in psychiatry and health and education. His CV covers such a broad collection of influences throughout New Zealand, and so he's had a lifetime of influence growing up in Fielding, still in Fielding, and wonderful to be sharing with us today. So thank you for joining us, Sir Mason Durie. Over to you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Chris. I'm just pulling up a PowerPoint, which will help me through this. What I should maybe start by saying is that really I'm not an expert in school education. And I was asked to be involved in this to see whether I might have some comments about, broad comments about school and its, particularly its impact on the spiritual side of life. So, of course, we're not talking about something new. Our first church school started, the first school in New Zealand actually started in 1816 in the Bay of Islands. And Thomas Kendall, who was an agent of Samuel Marsden's, and Hongi Hika talked together and launched this school in 1816. It was 33 students. It was very young people and people aged 20. I've seen the curriculum, and it was pretty practical curriculum. It was about how to use a cash economy. English was on the agenda, but growing vegetables, there were very practical things as well. In 1818, the school had to close. Lack of support, but it's important because that was the beginning. It was the first church school, the first school in New Zealand, and much of what we do today really reflects our history as well. So what followed in the 19th century was a range of schools began to open. 1844, the St. Stephen's Native Girls' School, which in 1860 became St. Stephen's School. So the boys took over from the girls and changed the name. Wesley College in 1844, Wakefield School in 1844, Christ College in 1850, Te Aute College in 1854, St. Joseph's in 1867, I think Whanau Collegiate in 1854 as well, and Rangiruru Girls' School. So there's various state schools as well as a range of church schools. And in the next century after that, of course, it flourished and large numbers developed. But these were some of the pioneering schools that have led to a position where we're at today. But I just really want to talk only about the school that I knew, the only school I knew, and some of the experience there, and just see whether that experience is still relevant today and whether it can be transferred or translated or seen as being relevant across a range of schools. So I went to Te Aute College, not necessarily by choice, but my grandfather had been at that school and he said, that's where you're going to go to school. And it was a boarding school, quite a small school then. I think we had about 130 on the roll. We stood by our motto, whakatangata kia kaha, quit you like men, be strong. It was interpreted in various ways, and we tended to interpret it according to what was on. But that's really what I want to talk about, is that experience, and then see whether that is a shared experience or whether things have changed to a large extent. These are, I think, the four sort of what I call enablers that were the highlights of the Te Aute experience. It was about lifting the spirit, enriching the mind, strengthening the body, and building relationships. They were the four key areas that I think, if you ask me what was the Te Aute experience about, that's what I would come to. And I just want to touch on each one of those, Chris, to see what it actually meant. If I look at the first of those, which was lifting the spirit, We spent a great deal of time in the chapel. The chapel was the oldest building on the campus. It dates back to Archdeacon Samuel Williams, who was involved and founded the school, actually. And the chapel was where we spent a lot of time. I think we tended to feel it was too much time, but every morning there was chapel at 8:30, and on Sundays 3 times a day. But it was an important focus for the school. What we learned there was a great deal about liturgy and about the faith. Bishop Norman Lesser was the diocesan bishop then, and we saw quite a lot of him. He sort of inspired us. We learned in those days, we had to learn by heart all of these prayers. So we knew the Apostles' Creed, the morning prayer, the evening prayer, the Psalms we learned. We just about knew the Book of Common Prayer off by heart. I don't say we understood it. We knew the words, but I wouldn't say that necessarily we had a sense of what they actually meant. But it was an important part of developing some understanding of religion in education. At the same time, we learned the same things in Maori. So that everything we learned in English, we learned in Maori, so that we had visiting Maori ministers, largely from the Waiapu diocese, who would come and spend time with us. And Bishop Whanau was sort of oversaw that side of it. But the same things, we learned about the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the morning prayer, afternoon, but in Maori. And there was quite a difference in the two. I'm not sure that we understood either of them word for word, but I think the attachment to it was probably a bit stronger when it was with Te Reo Maori, partly because we had some really entertaining ministers in those days, Hohe Pataiba, Wihuata and Sam Rangi, who sometimes turned up together and would do a trio, and that really got through to us and captured our thinking and our minds more. So the chapel then, and both the English and the Maori liturgies were a really important part of lifting the spirit. But the other thing that lifted the spirit was the environment that we lived in. That little picture at the bottom is a picture of the Te Aute landscape. And you can see there's not many houses there, but there's a lot of hills. And we were encouraged to roam around the farm. And I think that kind of lifted the spirit as well. There was one hill in particular called Pukenui, the big hill, and we used to climb to the top of that and then go across to another one called the Escarpment, look out from there, and the view was great. We were among the bush there. So I think this was part of lifting the spirit as well. And when things in the classroom got a bit boring or a bit tough, we would long to get out and get up to Pukenui and begin to look at, there was a stream there, and we used to go down to the stream. Eventually, there was a bigger stream which we could swim in. But the environment, I think, was key, one of the key factors that enabled us to get this notion of a heightened spirit. So those then, on this thing, if you would ask me, well, what was the spiritual component? We had the liturgy in English, Tikanga Maori liturgy, and the environment. I think they were the three things that sort of lifted us. You'll notice in that picture of the chapel that at the end there's a stained glass window, and sometimes in the morning the sun would come through that window, and actually a lot of us felt that that was the uplifting thing as well, seeing the sun. So a range of things, but all really adding to this notion of a spiritual experience. The other enabler was, of course, what schools do most, and that was to enrich the mind. We were lucky that we had some amazing pioneers to follow. These were Te Aute students from the early years. Api Raningata was the first Maori university graduate who had been at Te Aute in the early 1880s. 1884 to 1887. He went on to become a politician and played a hugely important role in New Zealand. And the first university graduate, the first Maori doctor, was a friend of his, Maui Pomare, and he graduated in Chicago, of all places, from a medical school, came back and worked in the Ministry of Health and eventually became a Minister of Health. So they're another inspiring figure. Ruati Kohere, who's in that picture there, was part of this young Maori party. They were all at Te Aute about the same time. He wrote a book about Proverbs and wrote other books as well. And then Sir Peter Buck, Te Rangi Hiro, as we know him, also graduated in medicine, so there were two doctors there. And he became the first professor, and that was at a university in Hawaii. So these were the people that we heard about continuously when we were at school. They were the ones who inspired us to do better. And we read their work extensively. So that was part of enriching the mind. I must admit, we used to get a bit muddled up sometimes because in the chapel we'd hear about Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. And then down on the next day on the assembly, we'd hear about Ngata, Pomare, and Buck. And in the third film, we sort of got them muddled up and began to think, which one of those three would have been the Holy Ghost? but the chaplain put us right on that one. The other thing that enriched the mind, of course, was the lessons we had. We had three really great teachers. Richard Webb was the headmaster, but he taught geography, and we weren't allowed to fail that one. And Watson Rosevere was the chaplain, and he taught us. He was a great English teacher as well. And Robbie Robson was in history and social studies. But this was an enriching experience. I think we were fortunate to have good teachers and fortunate enough to be inspired by what they were teaching. The other area of inspiration came from science, so that we had three really good science teachers. Sam Dwyer was a teacher in mathematics, made math seem so simple that we could take to algebra without too much trouble. Bill Mataira was a graduate from Victoria in science, and he took us into the world of chemistry and biology. And George Marsden was an agricultural expert, and he did that. So the scientific part of the education was there. It was not super. I mean, you see a picture there of the laboratory. That's what our lab was like. But it was really well taught. I must say, when I went to university, I took with me the notes that Bill Mataira had done for us in the fourth and fifth form, because he had really pushed us to take it to another level. And then there were, of course, the theological studies that were part of our curriculum, divinity classes, Bible studies, and the chaplain, Watson Rosevere, he took us for that. This was rather different from the chapel experience, in that it was more about trying to understand what the main points in the Bible, what it was about, what the history of the church was, and but it was different from the other subjects that we had. And then the final lot of subjects was in Mātauranga Māori. We had a teacher called Harold Wills. He wrote a number of books which were about Maori language, and he had an old way of teaching, so that if you weren't picking it up or if you're making a noise, you could feel one of those books hit you on the back of the head, which pulled us up pretty sharply. But he was also a good teacher, and he was not just teaching Maori language, he was teaching us about tikanga, Maori custom, protocols, whakapapa. Those were the things that were in there. So when it came to this question of enriching the mind, we had 4 different systems of knowledge going in front of us at the same time. They're all quite different. You can't explain humanities through science. and you can't explain theology through science or through humanities, and you can't explain Mātauranga Māori through the other three. These are all quite separate bodies of knowledge. The mistake is sometimes to try and think that one is sort of a version of the other, but they're separate. They have different rules, different ways of thinking. Because we didn't know that, we just go from one period to another. But what we were doing was actually being introduced to 4 ways of thinking about the world and 4 different systems of knowledge. The other thing, of course, that happened was at school was that strengthening the body was an important part of our work there. Rugby, of course, was on top of the list. It was compulsory. Everyone had to play rugby. We didn't have a huge number of people, so but everyone played. Used to catch the train at Pukeho and go into Hastings on a Saturday morning to play rugby there, and then catch the train back in the afternoon to Pukeho. It wasn't a long trip. It shouldn't have been a long trip. It was a short distance. But there were stops along the way for the shunting. It was a shunting train, so they used to take things on and off. But rugby was important. I think kapa haka was an important part for us of strengthening the body. It was because that's what it did, and you needed to be pretty fit actually to do that. And our phys ed teacher, Mr. Robson, was great on press-ups as a way of saving ourselves. There was another way of strengthening the body that I thought was more about challenging the body rather than strengthening it, because the food was sort of not what you'd call 5-star. The toast was always cold. The stew was served every day. Sago for pudding. So it wasn't great, but it was supplemented by parents bringing in food baskets that were devoured about midnight. And looking back on it, probably this sort of food was better than the too much food. We certainly didn't have that problem at school. A third way of strengthening the body was making use of the natural environment. Used to do quite a lot of swimming, roaming around on the hills. We also, in those days, Mantu testing, because tuberculosis was a problem that had affected some people. So we had compulsory testing and compulsory vaccination. And we used to wonder about that, and the explanation was that it is preventing you from getting sick so that you can still be strong. So that was an important part of the experience, was this different ways of strengthening the body. And then the other thing we learned was that the Te Aute experience was also about building relationships with earlier generations of the Te Aute whānau. And I've talked a bit about those, and then there are many, many others that we had a sense of connection with, largely because their children or grandchildren, sometimes great-grandchildren, were also at school. And so they used to talk a bit about their parents and grandparents. And we felt then that we had a relationship with the past. And I think that was pretty important for us to feel. The other thing, we used to have whānau, our families were involved at school quite a lot, especially at coming to watch us play rugby, or at the break-up or special services, or sometimes if we were doing a tour around the country, parents would come. We also had this intergenerational element, that the role, if you looked at the role of the student, you could see either father or an uncle or a grandfather. In my case, it was my uncle, my father's brother. My grandfather had been there. And I think that was pretty much the rule. Many of the relationships, of course, that you form at a school like this continue after you leave school. And we've had old boys sort of standing together as a group, and they're like a whānau. They're not a whānau, but they're like a whānau. And so this whole question of relationship building and sustaining relationships was an important part of that experience. And then, of course, there was this the recognition that we were not on our own. We were part of an ongoing story that, and we used to look back at the Moaska Cup team of 1920, which made history apparently, and something to aim for. There was we used to envy the 1910 tour of Australia because we never did that. We did a tour to Rotorua once and to New Plymouth a couple of times to play rugby. But there was this sort of relationship as well. So these then, I started out saying there were 4 enablers that helped define the experience that I had had at Te Aute. Lifting the spirit, it's the wairua. It's enriching the mind, the hinengaro. Strengthening the body, tinana, and building relationships, which is about whanau. So those what I've called are 4 enablers that really, you put them all together and you get a composite experience, for which I've always been really grateful. It's amazing when you leave school, you tend to be more grateful than when you're at school, particularly when it comes to mealtime. So the question I guess we ask is that I started talking about 1952, which is when I started school. We're now at 2020, which is a very challenging year. And we've got to look ahead, 2030. Will those enablers that I talked about still be relevant in 2020, or are they still relevant today? Will they still be relevant in 2030? My guess is they will be relevant, but in a different shape and in a different form. And that the experience that we've had may not replicate itself. I'm sure it doesn't. According to my grandchildren, it's very different. But those 4 enablers, I think, are still relevant, but they will be in different forms. One of the things that we can learn from this year is the COVID-19 experience, because it's really raised some interesting things about education generally. Do learners go to school, or do schools go to learners? Because in the lockdown, our schools were going to the learners, not the other way around. And it brings this question of, will the online curriculum actually become a norm in the future? And if it does, what will be its advantages and what will be its disadvantages? And the disadvantage, of course, may be that the relationship building is not so clear, or that the sense of togetherness is not so strong. But I don't know. I don't know a huge amount about online stuff, which is why I had trouble linking in today. And then the other point is this question of wairua, or spirituality. How do you convey that online through the internet? In COVID, I saw some really interesting things. We used to tune in every week to the Te Pihopatanga Aotearoa. They had karakia regularly, and it wasn't the same as being there, but it was important, and you could get the same sort of feeling from it. And I thought it was very good, and a demonstration that maybe there are ways in which wairua can be part of the internet. Perhaps a bigger question is there a moral code we should develop for online engagement? We don't really have that. When you go to chapel, there's a way of doing things. There's a routine and a system, and showing a respect. But online really lacks any sort of moral direction or moral code. So I think that's a question we need perhaps to think about, and that has become more evident since the COVID-19 experience. This whole question of online learning is something that we're going to have to look at. It'll be there. It'll probably be greater than it's been in the last decade. Well, it will be. But it needs to have some sort of feel about it if we're going to have wairua, or spirituality, and strengthening our bodies as important elements of learning. So they were really the main points that I just wanted to raise, Chris, that, and I've used the only school experience that I know, which was this one, and it may not be the same for everyone, but for me, these were the 4 things I think that I could say constituted the experience. Uplifting the spirit. What was important there was faith, tikanga Maori, and a connection with the environment. Taha hinengaro, which was enhancing the mind. And I mentioned that there were these different bodies of knowledge, different ways of looking at the world: theology, science, religion, mātauranga, and humanities. Different approaches, all constructed differently. If you put them all together, you don't fuse them. They're side by side, but you can get a pretty rich experience. And then the question of strengthening the body and sport, obviously important, nutrition, exercise, and health. And then the other point was about building relationships with the past, the earlier generations that we felt a connection to, participation with our own families, and having relationships that endure over time. So that's really what I wanted to share with you today, Chris.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Just a question, if I might, and I think there will be some questions come to you as a result of this, but you're involved in some education initiatives in the Manawatu now. How have these lessons that you've learnt from your own education been part of that journey?
Yes, well, I have been involved with a school called Manukura, which is taken off in Palmerston North, although it's actually based at our Maori and Fielding, but located in Palmerston. If I look at these things, they're pretty strong on all of them, so that their viewers, I mean, that the publicity is about their excellence in sport, but the testers are they excellent in NCA, and they are. Those two things seem to be going together. The Wairua part is maybe less evident in the religious side of it, but very strong on tikanga Maori, which is another spiritual experience, and a lot of attention to environmental connections. And whanau are an integral part of the school. So all of those four elements are there. I think probably the strongest ones are Hinengaro and Tenana and whanau, and then all four of them are evident.
Fantastic. And one of the fears that we often talk about with I talk about with other chaplains is that fear that we have that we might be giving just enough religion to young people to put them off for life, sort of a religious inoculation, if you might. How do you see your experience that being avoided?
Well, we had a lot of it every day at 8 o'clock, Sunday 3 times a day, the theology and classes. It was such an integral part of the life there that I think we embraced it rather than being put off by it. And it was due, I think, to people who led it. So our chaplain, Watson Rosevear, was a very matter-of-fact person. Then we had the Maori ministers who would come in, and they would have quite a jovial approach to what they were doing. So I think that didn't put us off. If anything, it made us embrace it a bit. We used to get a bit, a bit bored some going through the things on, but we used to get bored in class as well, and bored if we didn't get training for rugby, get a bit bored with that. But I think it was what was important about the religious side of it was that it wasn't just about faith; it was about lifting the spirit. And if the religious experience lifts the spirit, then I think it'll be embraced. And eventually, I think that's what we experienced there. I got a bit of a cough.
It's all good. That's fantastic. And obviously, the college itself has had such a strong heritage of raising leaders like yourself. You would say that's come through that whole Maori order that you've embraced there.
Well, I think so. I think that's if you would ask me what were the key factors that made education for us successful, they're the four areas that I would look at. Perhaps what's missing from there Although it's not missing, but it's there as well, and that is our teachers. They're very much part of all of those things, including the taha tinana and the wairua, yeah.
And, you know, you speak very fondly of them. Obviously, at the time, you might have thought a little bit differently, but in hindsight, you know, the way that you address them now speaks of the significant impact that they had on your life as a young community.
Well, when I went to university, I certainly recognised that I had been fortunate to have been well grounded in a number of areas.
In regards to the COVID dynamic, do you see us having a framework for that, developing that moral code for online engagement?
I'm sure there are frameworks, because I guess we've developed moral codes for all sorts of engagements. Sometimes the moral code has been about going to war. Sometimes it's been about managing people who are ill, unwell. But I think this will be a particular challenge for us. We need it. And I think it needs some wise heads and some young heads coming together to look at how do you actually, what's a safe way and a moral way of engaging online. And I don't think we have an answer, but my thing is I think we should develop that fairly quickly, because it's a whole, it's really pretty pervasive throughout, particularly for younger generations.
And particularly, I think there's a challenge there for taking those 4 baskets and interpreting them in the schools going to learners model, because
yes,
they don't happen by accident.
That's right. They're not going to happen by accident. It has to be a deliberate effort, not a default mechanism. I think over COVID we've regarded online learning as a default. It may actually need to be elevated a bit but a preferred option for some things and for some people. Probably not the exclusive option, but for some areas a preferred option.
And perhaps easier to engage with the online teaching rather than maybe the relationships or the strengthening of the body or the spirit.
Yes, yeah. Though I noticed in COVID there's some remarkable innovation of people who wanted to keep fit and keep training that they did while they were, including the man in the UK who was going to walk, and that's what he did.
Well, that's very, very encouraging. I think the plan is that I'm going to share this video with some of our other chaplains and RE teachers, and they might have a few questions to throw at you. So if we have another conversation in a week or so, would that be okay, just to answer a few extra questions?
Yeah.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today. I really do appreciate you spending this time and sharing of your own wealth of experience there.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.